There are moments in life when the soul feels as though it is treading water, arms flailing, lungs burning, and yet never quite sinking nor quite swimming. And in such moments we often cry out, not for distraction or entertainment, but for breakthrough. Not for a slight improvement, but for a chasm to be split wide open where there was once only a wall. And yet many do not perceive that the gate to this breakthrough does not swing on the hinges of effort or intellect, but on obedience, small, hidden obedience to the voice of God. Consider this: when God calls you to a 3-day fast, He is not imposing hunger but inviting hunger of a different kind. He is not diminishing your strength, but dismantling the illusion that strength was ever yours to begin with. For there is a kind of blindness that only hunger can cure, a kind of deafness that only silence can penetrate. The fast is not magic. It is not a transaction in which we bargain with the divine. It is a turning of the whole being toward heaven, a declaration that even bread which we may daily take for granted is not enough to satisfy the creature made in the image of the eternal. God did not craft your spirit to live by grain and meat alone. He breathed into dust, not wheat. He infused you with His own breath, and that is what sustains you. So when the command comes, fast for 3 days, it is not a punishment. It is not even primarily a test. It is an unsealing of an ancient pattern. 3 days, the same number of days between death and resurrection, between the tomb and the triumph. The fast is not the end, but the burial before the rising. In obeying it, you declare that your breakthrough is not forged by effort, but born in surrender. For some, these 3 days may feel barren, your mind may wander, your stomach may protest, but know this: in the unseen world, something is being shaken loose. Old chains are rusting and cracking. Prayers you whispered in darker hours are being taken off the shelf, for fasting, true fasting, speaks louder in heaven than many shouted sermons. And in the silence, in the ache of the body, in the stillness of the soul, He will whisper things you would not have heard over the clatter of ordinary life. Directions will come where confusion once ruled. Conviction will come where numbness once sat. Sometimes even the answer to your long prayed request is not a word, but a cleansing, a reordering, a setting right of things long crooked. This is not about asceticism. It is not about impressing angels. It is about obedience. And obedience, as we so often forget, is not measured in the magnitude of the act, but in the willingness to act. God does not need your strength, but He calls for your surrender. He does not need your schedule, but He asks for your days, 3 of them, and who knows what may be loosed in those days. What part of your soul may come alive again, what generational curse may snap. What clarity may arise like dawn after night. When you obey God's call to fast, you are not stepping into suffering, you are stepping into alignment. And where there is alignment with heaven, there is always breakthrough. So do not hesitate, do not demand to understand every detail before you obey. Obedience precedes revelation, and when the fast begins, walk in it not as one starving, but as one waiting for the feast that only heaven prepares. Let the ache in your body awaken the hunger in your spirit. Let the silence teach you to listen. Let the empty plate make room for the full table of God. Breakthrough is not a reward, it is an unveiling. The fast peels away what has clouded your eyes until you see the gates open before you, not because you earned it, but because you finally obeyed. Obedience to God's call, not intensity of effort, unlocks true spiritual breakthrough. This truth stands in direct contrast to much of what the world teaches about progress, success, and transformation. The world says, work harder, do more, push longer. It is a drumbeat of self-reliance, an anthem of willpower. Yet, in the realm of the Spirit, obedience often outweighs exertion. Breakthrough in God's kingdom is not earned like a wage, it is received like rain, undeserved, unpredictable, but drawn down by the hand raised in surrender. The person who obeys a quiet whisper from God, even when it costs them comfort or certainty, is nearer to breakthrough than the one who labors in religious busyness without listening. God's call is often small, precise, and costly. It may ask a man to leave his comfort or a woman to relinquish a plan. It may ask for silence when speaking would feel powerful. It may ask for stillness when running seems safer. The test is rarely about physical capacity. It is almost always about trust. When God called Abraham to sacrifice his son, it was not the knife or the climb or the altar that mattered. It was the act of radical obedience, and through that act, history shifted. When God called Jonah, it was not the storm or the fish or the Ninevites that determined the outcome, but Jonah's refusal and eventual surrender to a simple instruction. The power of God's work often waits on the other side of the smallest yes. This is why the call to fast for 3 days should never be dismissed as a minor command. It is, in fact, a profound invitation into the hidden ways of God. It is not the starvation of the body that brings the miracle, but the submission of the will. A person can abstain from food and remain proud, distracted, and unchanged. But when one yields their appetite to the Spirit out of obedience, not self, glory, not obligation, not pressure, they enter into the deep economy of grace. There, the effort is not in striving but in surrendering. The soul does not need to manufacture spiritual power. It needs only to bow to the God who already holds it. Effort in itself is not evil, but when it takes the place of obedience, it becomes its own idol. Many spiritual lives are spent building towers of self-righteous achievement. Prayers logged, hours served, books read. But those towers crumble when the voice of God calls and finds no listener. The breakthrough is not in how hard one has pushed, but how swiftly one has responded to God's voice. And that voice often comes not in thunder, but in whisper, not in command, but invitation. To fast for 3 days may seem a small ask in the eyes of some, but in the economy of heaven, the smallest act of yielded obedience can release the greatest flood of unseen blessing. A 3-day fast mirrors the death to resurrection pattern, sir. Ender precedes transformation. This divine sequence has been etched into the very structure of redemption. It is not merely symbolic, it is the spiritual architecture by which God reshapes human hearts and rewrites destinies. In Scripture, the number 3 is never incidental. Jonah was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days, enclosed in darkness before being released to fulfill God's commission. Jesus lay in the tomb for 3 days before rising in glory, turning the finality of death into the doorway of eternal life. This pattern of descent before ascent, burial before blooming, silence before the shout, reveals a divine rhythm that fasting invites the believer into. When God calls someone to a 3-day fast, He is not simply initiating a physical exercise, but aligning them with the story of transformation that has always governed His dealings with mankind. To fast is to willingly enter the tomb, not a literal grave, but the place where the flesh is quieted, the desires are surrendered, and the illusion of control is laid down. It is the place where all personal striving is buried, and the human will yields to divine timing. And in that space of emptiness, God begins the slow, hidden work of resurrection. But the resurrection does not come on day 1, nor on day 2. It arrives only after the full measure of surrender has been poured out. This is why many struggle with breakthrough. They long for transformation but resist the tomb. They want the power of resurrection without the humility of death. But God's power is not poured into unbroken vessels. It waits, instead, for the heart that has been stripped of its own plans and is willing to be remade. The fast creates this kind of heart. It carves space. It empties the vessel. It prepares the soul not by adding more, but by removing what never belonged in the first place. On the surface, it may appear quiet, uneventful, even uncomfortable. But in the hidden places, roots are being torn out, foundations are being reset, and a new strength is being formed, not by addition, but by subtraction. The death to resurrection pattern also protects us from the lie that transformation is instant. True change is not cosmetic. It is foundational, and anything foundational must be buried before it can rise. The first day of the fast feels like dying, the second feels like waiting, the third, often unseen until it dawns, is where the light begins to pierce the grave, and that light does not merely shine around us, it alters us. It brings clarity where confusion once ruled, softness where hardness had taken root, and direction where aimlessness once sat. This is not self-improvement dressed up in religious clothing. This is divine intervention prepared through human surrender. It is the miracle of resurrection, not of circumstance only, but of the human heart itself. Fasting clears spiritual noise, aligning the soul to hear and move with heaven's rhythm. The human life is filled with constant clatter, voices, demands, distractions that crowd the mind and numb the heart. In the midst of this noise, God's voice is not absent, but it is easily drowned. He speaks not in earthquakes or fires, but in stillness, and fasting makes room for that stillness to emerge. When one fasts, the body grows quiet, and so does the soul. The clutter begins to fall away, not because it is forcibly removed, but because it is no longer being fed. Fasting strips the unnecessary, pulls away the layers of worldly static, and tunes the spirit to divine frequency. The soul, left untended, becomes cluttered. It picks up the residue of anxieties, ambitions, jealousies, and fears, even good things, work, family, ministry, and become sources of noise if they are not regularly laid before God. Fasting becomes a divine reset, not merely of appetite, but of alignment. It reminds the believer that life is not sustained by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And in the silence of fasting, that word can finally be heard. It may come as conviction or comfort or calling, but it comes, not because the fast forces God to speak, but because it finally creates space for the soul to listen. In the natural world, tuning an instrument requires silence. One cannot adjust the strings of a violin while a crowd is shouting, so too with the spirit. Fasting is the tuning of the inner instrument to resonate with the divine melody. It does not guarantee that one will immediately feel spiritual. In fact, it often begins with dryness, with agitation, with resistance. But beneath those early sensations lies the work of reordering. The cravings that rise to the surface are not signs of failure, but signs of cleansing. They are the surfacing of attachments that were hiding behind comfort and routine, and once seen they can be surrendered, and once surrendered the soul begins to breathe again. This is where alignment takes place. The inner compass that had begun to tilt under pressure is recalibrated. Priorities shift, desires are purified, the heart begins to ache not for indulgence but for intimacy, and in this realignment, breakthrough becomes possible. Not because the circumstances change, but because the person does. Fasting does not bend God's will to our own, it bends our will to His. It brings us into rhythm with the divine, where movement becomes grace-filled and decisions flow from peace rather than panic. In this rhythm, obedience becomes natural, joy becomes rooted, and burdens become lighter not because they vanish, but because they are now carried in step with the Spirit. The clarity that emerges during a fast is not the result of mystical technique, but of holy subtraction. One by one, the distractions lose their hold. The inner voice of God, once muffled, now rises like a melody remembered. Directions once tangled begin to untwist. The noise fades, and what remains is presence, God's presence steady and sure.